Sabrina Vale walked into her mother's retirement party, wearing the bracelet her mother had given her on her wedding day. And she was the only person in that room who knew the bracelet didn't belong to her mother anymore. It belonged to the Ashton Family Trust, and it had for 11 years. If you're new here, please hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see where in the world you're watching from tonight. The party was held at the Ashton family home in Savannah, Georgia, which was the kind of house that didn't just have a history, it had a mythology. 3 stories of antebellum architecture set back from a cobblestone street lined with live oaks that had been growing since before the Civil War. The kind of house that appeared in magazines without being submitted. The kind that people drove slowly past on Sunday afternoons and wondered about the lives inside. Sabrina had spent 23 years building that mythology with her own hands. She had sourced the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway from a restoration specialist in Charleston. She had commissioned the ironwork on the garden gate from an 80-year-old blacksmith in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She had spent 4 months corresponding with a horticultural society to identify the original plant species of the garden before replanting it exactly as it had appeared in photographs from 1908. Her mother-in-law, Eleanor Ashton, was the one who had asked her to do all of it. Her husband, Whitmore Ashton, had never once noticed. Sabrina arrived at the party alone. Whitmore had told her he would meet her there. He was coming from the office, he said, which meant he was coming from wherever it was. He went when he said he was at the office. She had stopped believing the office story 14 months ago. She had stopped saying so 8 months ago, because she understood by then that confrontation was not the same as power, and she was very, very interested in power. The house was already full when she arrived. Savannah money moved in specific social formations, and tonight all of it had organized itself around the event that Eleanor Ashton was formally stepping down as chair of Ashton Properties, the real estate development company her late husband had founded in 1971, and that Whitmore had been running, or believed he had been running, since 2018. 120 guests, caterers in navy jackets, a jazz quartet in the corner, the smell of magnolia and champagne, and old money doing what old money always does, which is pretend it's simply a natural feature of the landscape. Sabrina accepted a glass of sweet tea from a passing tray and began to move through the room in the way she had learned. To move through rooms like this, which was not invisibly, exactly, but strategically. She had presence. She had always had presence. But she had learned over 2 decades of being Whitmore Ashton's wife to hold it still. To be the kind of woman people remembered warmly but didn't feel threatened by, because Whitmore required that her light never outshine his. She was near the garden doors when she felt the shift. Not a sound. A change in the room's attention, the way a current changes direction beneath still water. She turned, slowly, the way she had practiced turning in rooms like this, unhurried, naturally. Whitmore had arrived. He was 51, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who had inherited money and mistaken it for character. He wore it the way he wore everything, casually, as if it had always simply been his. His hair was silver at the temples, in a way that his barber maintained carefully to look distinguished rather than old. And beside him, tucked under his arm with the proprietary ease of a woman who had been practicing this entrance, was Crystal Soane. Sabrina had seen photographs. Everyone had. Crystal was 32 years old and worked in marketing at a firm Whitmore's company had retained. She had the specific kind of beauty that photographs extremely well, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from being told, repeatedly, by a powerful man, that you are extraordinary. Tonight she was wearing a dress the color of champagne, and around her wrist, Sabrina looked at the bracelet. The bracelet that had belonged to Eleanor Ashton's mother. The one Eleanor had pressed into Sabrina's hands at her wedding and said, very quietly, in a voice that didn't allow for argument, "This belongs with someone who understands what it means to hold a family together." The bracelet that had been catalogued as a protected asset of the Ashton Family Trust in 2013. 3 years before, Whitmore had any legal authority to remove it from the family vault. Crystal saw her looking. She raised her wrist. slightly, let the light catch the gold, and smiled. The smile of a woman who had decided that the outcome of tonight was already settled. Sabrina turned back to her sweet tea. "He practiced that entrance," said a voice beside her. She turned. Eleanor Ashton was 74 years old and had the physical presence of a woman who had long ago stopped, requiring the room's permission to take up space. Small, white-haired, dressed in dove gray with one strand of pearls that were genuine and not excessive. She had the kind of stillness that comes from having outlasted a great many storms. "He holds his chin at a different angle when he's rehearsed something," Eleanor continued, not looking at Sabrina, looking at her son across the room. "He has done it since he was 9 years old," Sabrina said. "Eleanor, don't," the older woman said calmly. "Don't look at me like you're deciding what I am to you tonight. I have told you before, I don't operate in categories. I operate in what's true." Sabrina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That bracelet, I know. He didn't have the authority." "I know that too." Eleanor finally turned and looked at her directly, "which is exactly why tonight is not over." She touched Sabrina's arm once, a brief, dry pressure. "Trust the structure." And then she moved away into the crowd, accepting a glass of wine from a passing tray. Pausing to kiss the cheek of an elderly judge she had known for 40 years, Sabrina stood with her sweet tea and a feeling she could not name. Not hope. Something older than hope. Something that had been waiting a very long time to be useful. Whitmore found her 20 minutes later. He always found her at parties. Not because she was a fixture. And powerful men are deeply uncomfortable when their fixtures are not in their proper places. "Sabrina," he said pleasantly, "the way you say the name of something that used to require your attention." "Whitmore," she said. Christelle pressed close to his side and looked at Sabrina with the frank assessment of a woman taking inventory of everything she believed she had replaced. "So this is," she started. "Sabrina Ashton, yes," Sabrina said. She let the full name land. Then she looked at Christelle with a kind of curiosity that is far more unsettling than anger. "I like your dress." Christelle's smile held, but something behind it flickered. She had prepared for coldness. She had prepared for tears. She had not prepared for sincere. "Enjoy your evening," Sabrina said, and moved away. Behind her she heard Whitmore say something, and then Christelle laugh. And then Whitmore's voice carrying just far enough. She always did know how to make an exit look like she was choosing it. Several people nearby pretended they hadn't heard. Their faces said something different. The next hour was the particular social cruelty of old money circles, which is that nothing is said directly and everything is communicated anyway. Sabrina held her sweet tea and spoke to people who were visibly uncertain about whether being seen with her tonight was an asset or a liability. She watched Whitmore and Christelle work the room together with the choreographed ease of a performance they had rehearsed elsewhere, in private, many times before. And she thought about something her friend Theodora had said to her 8 months ago, when Sabrina had finally, carefully told her what she was building toward. "They always think the quiet is surrender," Theodora had said. "That's the only way this works." Sabrina was standing near the garden doors, alone for a moment, when she noticed the man she didn't recognize. Late 40s, dark suit, nothing flashy. Standing with a glass of bourbon and doing the same thing she was doing. Watching the room while appearing to watch nothing. He looked at her, then looked away, then looked back. "Sabrina Ashton," he said. "Not a question. You have the advantage," she said carefully. "Fletcher Nash," he said it simply. "I don't think we've spoken directly, but I've been familiar with your work for quite some time." He paused. "The Hargrove Street conversion, the Beaumont Historic District reclamation, the Morrison Hotel project." She went still. "Those were Ashton Properties projects. Projects that bore Whitmore's name on the press releases. Projects where the original acquisition strategy, the financing architecture, the zoning variance negotiations had been built by one person in a home office while Whitmore attended the ribbon cuttings. "You're the forensic analyst," she said. "Financial restructuring," he said with a slight correction that was also a small smile. "The word forensic makes the wrong people nervous at the wrong moments." He glanced across the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been in rooms like this before. "Not tonight, not here. but I wanted to introduce myself." He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "And to tell you that, when I watched you walk away from that conversation a few minutes ago," he paused, "I was glad you didn't leave." Sabrina looked at him carefully. "The next 30 minutes are going to matter," he said. "And it matters that you're in the room when it happens." "What happens in 30 minutes? He considered her for a moment. "Nothing that hasn't been carefully prepared," he said. "Nothing that isn't already in motion." He set his glass on a passing tray. "Eleanor Ashton is a remarkable woman." He nodded once and moved away into the crowd with the unhurried ease of someone who had said exactly as much as he intended. Sabrina stood very still. Fletcher Nash, the name connected to meetings she had attended, to documents she had signed, to a process that had been building. She understood now. Not for months, but for years. She had thought she was moving alone. She was beginning to understand that she had never been alone in this at all. Across the room, Eleanor was in conversation with the elderly judge. They appeared to be simply two old friends at a party. Margaret Ashton was laughing at something, he said. It looked like nothing. Sabrina had learned to look past what things looked like. Whitmore took the small stage at the far end of the parlor at precisely 8:15. A microphone had been set up. He didn't really need it. Whitmore Ashton was a man who had never had difficulty projecting. The jazz quartet stopped. The crowd gathered. Whitmore smiled out at the room, the way he smiled at everything, as though its attention was his natural inheritance. 22 years ago, he said, my father built something in this city. A company, yes, but more than that, a legacy. He paused. He was good at pauses. And tonight, as my mother steps into a well-earned retirement, I want to say something about the future of that legacy. He reached back and took Christelle's hand, drawing her forward. The room murmured. Christelle and I, Whitmore said, are engaged. The applause was the careful, uncertain kind. The applause of people buying time to read the room. A few women near the front looked delighted. Others went very still. Sabrina did not move. And I want to say something else. Whitmore's voice carried the full weight of a man who had spent years treating every room as a stage. Ashton Properties is entering a new chapter. We're going to modernize the portfolio, streamline the structure, take the company into the future. He glanced, not obviously, but everyone in that room knew exactly where he was looking. In the direction of where Sabrina stood. It's time to stop being sentimental about the past and start building something worthy of the next generation. He had not said her name. He didn't need to. Every person in that room understood who the sentiment referred to. Sabrina heard a woman, two people to her right, draw a slow breath. She heard someone behind her say very quietly, he didn't have to do it like that. She stood there and let every word settle over her, and she thought about what Fletcher had said 8 months ago, when she had first shown him the full scope of what she had quietly assembled. The people who mistake silence for defeat, he had said, always celebrate before it's finished. That's the only opening you need. After the speech, the room rearranged itself the way these rooms always do. People who had been warm drifted toward safer conversations. The senator's wife, who had hugged Sabrina at the door, was suddenly absorbed in something fascinating across the parlor. A real estate developer she had known for a decade found an urgent reason to check his phone. The social chicanery of Savannah, money. Everyone waited for the current to declare itself, and then everyone moved with it, in perfect synchronized naturalness, as though the movement had always been their own idea. Sabrina walked to the garden doors and looked out at the courtyard. She had designed that garden, not in the abstract way of someone who hires a landscaper and approves a plan. She had knelt in the dirt in old jeans and planted the Confederate jasmine along the south wall herself. On a Saturday in April, 12 years into her marriage, when she had still believed that things built with your own hands carry a particular kind of permanence, she pressed her hand flat against the cool glass. Honestly, said a voice behind her, I don't understand why she even came. If I were her, I'd have had enough self-respect to stay home. Crystal. Speaking to a woman Sabrina didn't recognize, Dara Finch, who wrote for a Savannah lifestyle magazine and had the particular gift of amplifying exactly the wrong things at exactly the right moments. I mean, Christelle continued, when it's over, it's over. I just think there's something a little I don't know. She laughed softly. Desperate about showing up. Sabrina turned around. Christelle saw her and did not look even slightly embarrassed. She simply met her gaze and smiled. Oh, were we too loud? Sabrina looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. That bracelet, she said, very quietly, belonged to Eleanor Ashton's mother. It was catalogued as a protected asset of the Ashton Family Trust in 2013. The trust requires written authorization from all 3 trustees before any asset can be transferred, gifted, or removed from the family inventory. She paused. How many trustees authorize giving it to you? The smile on Christelle's face shifted just slightly, for just a fraction of a second. Then it reset. Whitmore gave it to me, she said. He gave you something? Sabrina agreed pleasantly. Whether he had the legal standing to give it is a different question. She looked at Dara Finch for exactly 1 second, long enough to be deliberate, brief enough to be deniable, and walked away. She pulled out her phone as she moved through the room and sent a text to a number saved under a first name only. She's talking to Dara Finch about the company restructuring. The reply came back in under a minute. Perfect. 20 minutes. Sabrina put her phone away. She looked across the room at Whitmore, still receiving congratulations near the fireplace. At Christelle, recovering her performance for Dara Finch's recorder. At 120 guests who had come to witness what Whitmore Ashton had choreographed as a coronation. She thought about what her mother had told her when she was 14, after a girl at school had stood up in front of their entire class and told a lie that made Sabrina look foolish. Sabrina had come home furious, wanting to retaliate immediately, loudly, visibly. Her mother had sat her down at the kitchen table and said, "Baby, the people who have real power don't announce it. They use it and they choose the moment." 20 minutes. Sabrina ordered a glass of water from the bar and stood where she could see everything, and she waited. It was Eleanor who moved first. No announcement, no gesture toward the microphone. She simply rose from her chair near the fireplace and walked, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who owned every inch of the floor beneath her feet, toward the small stage where her son had stood. 40 minutes earlier. People noticed. Then more people noticed. The way a room notices when someone whose presence carries genuine weight begins to move with purpose. By the time Eleanor reached the stage, 2/3 of the guests had already oriented toward her. The rest followed within seconds, the way crowds always do, reading the current, adjusting direction, without knowing why. Whitmore noticed. Sabrina watched his face from across the room, the brief flicker of something uncertain, before the easy confidence reasserted itself. He excused himself from the men around him and began moving toward the front of the room. Christelle materialized at his side. Eleanor looked out at the room. She didn't need the microphone either. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been filling large rooms for 50 years. This family, this company, this home, they have always been about one thing. About what we build and what we protect and what we refuse to abandon simply because someone tells us it's time to let go. Polite applause. Whitmore was almost to the front now, smiling the smile of a man who assumes his mother is about to offer a blessing. "There are several things sold I need to make clear tonight," Eleanor continued, and the room felt the change in her voice. Before anyone could have explained why. The same words, the same quiet tone, but something beneath it now, something with the density of bedrock. "Not because I enjoy disruption, but because the truth has a way of making its you don't meet it first." The ambient noise of 120 people receded. The room paid attention the way rooms only pay attention when something real is happening. "The bracelet," Eleanor said clearly, "currently on Crystal Sowane's wrist." The kindness that followed was the kind that has physical weight. Crystal's hand moved, an involuntary gesture almost protective, toward her chest. "That bracelet," Eleanor continued, "is a registered asset of the Ashton Family Trust, established in 1989 under the original estate agreement signed by my late husband and myself. It requires written, dated authorization from all 3 acting trustees before it may be gifted, transferred, or removed from the family inventory for any purpose." She looked at her son. "Whitmore, how many trustees authorized that transfer?" Whitmore's face had gone very still. "Mother, how many?" she said again. The same absolute. The silence stretched. None, Eleanor said, because no authorization was sought. She looked at her son for a moment longer, then turned to Christelle directly. I owe you an apology. You were given something under false pretenses. That was not fair to you. She paused. The bracelet will need to be returned to the family inventory this evening. The graciousness of it was devastating. By apologizing to Christelle, Eleanor had made it impossible for Christelle to appear as the wronged party. She had positioned her with perfect civility, not as a victim, but as the recipient of something that was never available to give. Christelle's hands were shaking slightly as she unclasped the bracelet. A man Sabrina recognized as the Ashton family attorney stepped forward with a small velvet case. A man who had been a guest at this party, who was now visibly not having the quiet evening he had anticipated, but who was clearly not surprised because he had come prepared. He accepted the bracelet. He stepped back. Whitmore's face was white. There is more, Eleanor said, not triumphantly, simply as information. The executive authority Whitmore has held over Ashton properties since 2018 has been placed under formal review by the trust board due to a pattern of financial decisions that constitute a material breach of fiduciary responsibility. That authority has been suspended, effective today, pending the outcome of the review. You can't do that. Whitmore's voice was low, but the room was silent enough that it carried everywhere. The trust board voted this afternoon, Eleanor said. It's already been done. This afternoon. He took a step forward, the controlled disbelief of a man arriving at a wall he didn't know was there. You planned this. You set this up. You came here tonight and you planned. I protected the family, Eleanor said, which is what I have always done. She looked at her son with something that was not cruelty. It was not indifference. It was the particular exhausted clarity of a woman who loves someone and is no longer willing to absorb the cost of shielding them from who they have chosen to be. Sit down, Whitmore, she said, before you say something in this room that cannot be undone. The silence was absolute, and Whitmore Ashton, who had walked into this house 2 hours ago, believing the night was entirely his, sat down. The doors at the back of the parlor opened. Fletcher Nash walked in. He was not alone. Beside him was a woman Sabrina recognized as Josephine Carver. Wait, she caught herself. No. This woman's name was something else entirely. Sabrina knew her from documents, from signatures, from a meeting in an attorney's office on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks ago. Her name was Vera Osman, one of the most prominent corporate property attorneys in Georgia. She moved through the room with the composure of someone for whom rooms full of powerful people are simply a professional habitat. Fletcher walked to the front without stopping. He placed a document folder on the table beside the stage. He looked up at the room. My name is Fletcher Nash, he said. I am a certified forensic financial analyst, and I have been conducting an independent audit of Ashton properties, asset holdings, and corporate structure for the past 16 months at the request of the company's controlling interest holder. Whitmore made a sound that didn't reach the level of a word. Ashton Properties, Fletcher continued, was originally capitalized in 1971 through a combination of family assets and an external investment structure. That structure included a silent equity position held in a protected trust. That trust has never been publicly disclosed. It was designed specifically to maintain anonymity. He opened the folder. The holder of the controlling interest in that trust, the individual with majority authority over the company's board decisions, executive appointments, and asset disposition, is Sabrina Elaine Ashton. The room did what rooms do when the ground shifts. It made a sound that was not quite speech. A collective involuntary exhale, a surge of heads turning, hands finding other hands, the compressed whisper of disbelief spreading outward from every corner simultaneously. Whitmore turned and found Sabrina across the room. For the first time in their marriage, truly, genuinely, for the first time, he looked at her without seeing his own reflection. She held his gaze. She did not perform anything. She did not smile. She simply looked back at the man who had spent 23 years standing in rooms she had built and calling them his own, with the steady, direct gaze of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly this long. That's not. He stopped. Restarted. I built this company. I know every filing, every share structure, every board decision." "You knew what was shown to you," Fletcher said simply. The controlling trust was structured to be invisible to the executive layers. Ashton has held this position since the trust was formalized in 2009. The number landed on Whitmore like something physical. "That's 15. 15 years, Fletcher said. "Yes." Christelle was no longer touching Whitmore's arm. She had taken one step back, then another, a subtle repositioning that was small enough to deny and unmistakable to anyone watching. Her champagne glass was pressed against her lips, and she was staring at a fixed point, somewhere above the crowd, with the expression of a woman rapidly recalculating the value of every decision that had brought her to this specific room. "Furthermore," Fletcher said, and Sabrina watched Whitmore's face absorb the word, "furthermore," like a blow he had not braced for. "The audit has identified a consistent pattern of misappropriating funds dating to fiscal year 2020. Under the terms of the original shareholders' agreement, documented misappropriation by the chief executive triggers an automatic review clause and an emergency board vote." He looked up. That vote was conducted by remote session. At 4 p.m. this afternoon, it was unanimous. He paused. "Whitmore Ashton has been removed as CEO of Ashton Properties, effective immediately. Sabrina Ashton, as controlling interest holder, will oversee the transition management structure." The room was beyond silence. It was the particular stillness of people who have witnessed something larger than they anticipated, and whose usual social responses have simply stopped working. Whitmore stood in the center of it, and for just a moment, just one unguarded, unperformed moment, he looked like what he actually was. A man who had confused the appearance of building things for the actual act of it. A man who had stood in rooms constructed by someone else and grown so accustomed to the view that he had stopped being able to imagine it any other way. He turned to Sabrina. "You wouldn't," he said. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Whitmore," she said. "I just did." 3 words. She said them without raising her voice, without moving toward him, without any performance at all. She simply stood in the room she had made, in the life she had built, and let the words do the work that 23 years of silence could. His face moved through several things quickly. Disbelief. A flash of something almost like recognition, buried almost instantly under fury. Then the specific expression of a man who has just understood, in a room full of witnesses, that the ground beneath him was never his to begin with. "This is a setup," he said. His voice had lost its certainty. The fracture was audible now. "You walked in here with prepared documents. This was coordinated. You planned. Every finding is documented, dated, and independently verified." Fletcher said evenly, "Your attorneys are welcome to review the complete package. We anticipated that request." He gestured to Vera Osman, who nodded with the calm professionalism of a woman who had been in rooms like this many times and found them entirely manageable. Whitmore looked at his mother. "You did this," he said. The voice of a son discovering that the person he assumed was always in his corner had been, quietly and methodically, standing somewhere else entirely. "My own mother. You went in front of the truth," Eleanor said. "Which is exactly where I have always stood." She looked at her son. Something in her face did not change, the exhaust, precise final clarity of a woman who has loved someone for 51 years and is no longer willing to let that love be a form of damage. "Sit down," she said again, softer this time, more final. He sat. Christelle had drifted further back. A few more steps. She was now standing at the clear edge of Whitmore's orbit, not beside him, but adjacent to, in the particular way that said everything about where she planned to be when the room finished settling. She had her phone in her hand, Sabrina noticed. She was looking at it. She was not in shock. She was thinking. Fletcher came to Sabrina's side and spoke quietly. "The board notification went through at 4:17, he said. The vote was 4-0, his own people. Sabrina absorbed this. The men who had golfed with Whitmore, who had attended his dinners, who had smiled across tables with him for a decade. "He'll fight it," she said. "Of course," Fletcher said. "That's why we spent 16 months making sure there's nothing to fight with." He paused. "Vera's team filed the asset freeze this afternoon. He won't be able to move anything tonight." Sabrina nodded. Around her, the room was doing what rooms do after an earthquake, reorganizing itself according to the new landscape. People who had avoided her all evening were looking at her differently now. Not all of them warmly, some with calculation, some with genuine surprise, but all of them looking, which was itself the change. Eleanor descended from the stage area and came directly to Sabrina. She took both of Sabrina's hands in hers. Her grip was dry and deliberate. "Are you all right?" she asked. The simplicity of it, the weight of it, the 23 years of quiet understanding compressed into 3 words. Sabrina felt something in her chest that she had not expected to feel tonight. "Ask me again in an hour," she said honestly. Something moved in Eleanor's eyes. "I should have done this sooner," she said. "Years sooner. I want you to know that I am sorry for the years I didn't." "You did it now," Sabrina said. "That's what matters." The older woman held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, the kind of nod that closes one thing and opens another, and moved away to resume a conversation that looked from the outside entirely ordinary. Eleanor Ashton had the gift of making the extraordinary look routine. Fletcher touched Sabrina's elbow lightly. "He's on his phone," he said. Whitmore had risen from his chair and was pacing a tight circle near the fireplace, phone pressed to his ear. His face had rearranged itself from shock into a contained, strategic fury that was in some ways more focused than the open disbelief had been. He was not finished. She had known he would not be finished. That was fine. She had built for the long game. She had been building it since long before tonight. 15 minutes later, Whitmore crossed the room toward her. Fletcher shifted slightly to her left. Sabrina touched his arm once, gently, and he understood she would handle this herself. Whitmore stopped in front of her. There was a strange intimacy to the moment, the intimacy of 2 people who had shared a bed and a breakfast table, and a company and a city for 2 decades, standing now on opposite sides of something that could not be walked back. "How long?" he said. She knew what he meant. "The trust structure was established in 2009, she said. The controlling position was formalized before the company's first significant acquisition, 15 years. He said it the way you say a number when you're trying to make it real, and it won't cooperate. And you never looked," she said. Not unkindly, precisely. "You saw what you expected to see. You expected to see me managing what you'd given me permission to manage. So that's what you saw." Something moved in his jaw. "Tonight you called. The company's history, something to get past," she said. "You said it was time to stop being sentimental. You said the past was something the future needed to be made worthy of leaving behind." She paused. "I built the past you were dismissing. I built the acquisition strategy. For every major property this company holds, I was the architect. You just never looked at the blueprints long enough to see whose name was on them." He stared at her. He said, "Why did you let me?" He stopped. "Why did you never say?" "Because I loved you," she said, simply, without drama. "For a long time I loved you. And I believed that what we were building together mattered more than who received the credit." She looked at him steadily. "I was wrong about that. It took me a while to understand why." He held her gaze, something in it that she had not seen in years, something genuine and without performance. "I have to contest the board decision," he said finally. "You understand that?" "I know," she said. "Fight it. That's your right. That's what the process is for." She met his eyes. "But Whitmore, the documents are real. The trust is real. The vote is real. Your attorneys can work for 2 years and those things will still be true." A beat. "I have always been real," she said. "I have always been here. Tonight you just finally had to see me." He held her gaze for a long moment, then he turned and walked away. She watched him go. She felt grief. She had expected anger, had expected relief, had even steeled herself for a kind of complicated triumph. She had not expected grief, not for the marriage, not for the betrayal, for something simpler and harder to name. For the 2 people they might have been, in a different version of the same years, if he had ever once looked up from his own reflection, long enough to truly see her. That grief lasted about 5 seconds. Then Fletcher was beside her. "You okay?" "Yes," she said, and meant it this time. "There's something else," he said. His voice had shifted to the register he used when information was important and needed to be absorbed without a visible reaction. She looked at him. "The company's property holdings," he said. "We haven't gotten to that part yet." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The Ashton Properties portfolio is part of the corporate structure. That's what the board review covers, the corporate holdings." "Yes," Fletcher said, "but the family home, this house, is a separate matter." Sabrina was very still. "In 2012, he said, Eleanor executed a transfer of the deed for this property into a separate, protected trust. A real estate holding trust designed specifically to insulate the family home from personal or corporate liability." He looked at her directly. "The beneficiary named in that trust as of 2015 is you." The sounds of the room continued around her. The jazz quartet, which had quietly resumed playing, the murmur of guests recalibrating in real time, the clink of glasses. Sabrina heard none of it. "The divorce proceedings," she said slowly. "Whitmore's attorneys assumed he held this property outright. He never held clear title," appearing at Sabrina's other side with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been listening from just outside the conversation and had timed her entry perfectly. "And he couldn't transfer what he didn't fully own. The property disposition, as negotiated in the preliminary divorce agreement, is legally voidable. We filed the challenge this afternoon concurrent with the board action. Given the trust documentation, which has been on file since 2012 and is completely clean, the likely resolution is straightforward." Sabrina turned and found Eleanor across the room. The older woman was deep in conversation, but she looked up, as though she had felt the gaze, and for just a moment, across the charged, complicated, reshaped wreckage of the evening. Whitmore had planned. The two women looked at each other. Eleanor's face was composed, as always, but her eyes said what composed faces cannot say. "I saw you. From the beginning, I saw you." Sabrina's chest did something complicated and quiet. She nodded once. Eleanor nodded back. Someone near Whitmore said something, low, and Sabrina caught the words Christelle, and left in 10 minutes ago. She looked across the room. The space where Christelle had been standing was empty. A woman near the coat room door confirmed it. A moment later, more audibly than she likely intended, "I saw her leave." She called her own car. Whitmore heard it. Sabrina watched him hear it. The slight freeze, the recalibration, the particular expression of a man, processing what it means when the woman he brought as a declaration of victory has departed without telling him she was going. He did not break down. He was Whitmore Ashton, and he did not do that in public. But the room saw his face for just long enough. In a room like this, that was more than enough. At 10:40, two people Sabrina recognized as property attorneys arrived at the front entrance. The family attorney, who had accepted the bracelet earlier, moved to meet them. Documents were exchanged. There was a brief professional conversation. Whitmore, who had been watching from across the room, went rigid. Fletcher leaned close to Sabrina. "It's a formal notice of the deed challenge and a request that the property be secured pending court review. Given that Eleanor holds trustee authority over the holding trust, she has the standing to request it." He paused. "He has about 10 minutes to choose how he wants this to go." Sabrina looked at the garden doors, at the Confederate jasmine along the south wall, which she could not see in the dark, but knew was there. She had planted it on a Saturday in April, 12 years into a marriage that had been quietly, methodically misrepresenting its own foundations for longer than she had known. She had knelt in the dirt and pressed each root down herself because she had believed that things built with your own hands had a particular kind of permanence. She had been right. She just hadn't understood yet that the thing she was building with her own hands was not the marriage. "This house," she said quietly, "has not been his for a long time." "No," Fletcher agreed, "it hasn't." Whitmore left at 10:53. Sabrina didn't watch him go. She heard the change in the room, the subtle collective shift in pressure that told her the moment had passed. Someone near the entrance confirmed it in a low voice. Whitmore Ashton had walked out through the front door of the house he believed he had inherited, gotten into a car, and driven away from the building that bore his family's name. Without Christelle, without the bracelet, without the company, without the title, without anything that had not been his to begin with. Eleanor appeared beside her. The older woman's composure was intact, but her eyes were bright with something that was not triumph, and was not satisfaction. Something more honest and more tired than either of those things. "He's gone," she said. "I know," Sabrina said. "He called me a traitor," Eleanor said. "In the hall, before he left," she said it matter-of-factly. "He said I chose you over him." Sabrina looked at her carefully. "Are you all right? He's my son," Eleanor said simply. "That doesn't change. It will never change." She was quiet for a moment. "But love is not protection from consequence. I confused those two things for a long time." She straightened her small shoulders. "I won't confuse them anymore." Sabrina reached out and put her hand over Eleanor's. "Come," the older woman said. "There are people here who want to talk to you. Real conversations, the kind you have been cut off from for too long." She looked at Sabrina with something fierce and gentle at once. "You have an extraordinary amount of reclaiming to do." And she steered Sabrina, gently but firmly, back into the room. What followed was unlike anything Sabrina had experienced in 23 years of Ashton events. People talked to her. Not through her, not past her, not to the woman, standing beside the executive whose name was on the letterhead. To her, to the person who had, apparently, been the structural foundation of one of Savannah's most significant real estate companies for 15 years, without anyone in this room being any the wiser. The conversations were real. A developer asked about the Morrison Hotel acquisition strategy. A financier asked about the portfolio restructuring timeline. A woman who sat on 2 nonprofit boards and who had spent years exchanging polite small talk with Sabrina at these events pulled her aside and said quietly and directly, "I always knew there was more to you than he allowed the room to see. I'm sorry it took this long." Sabrina thanked her and moved on. Fletcher found her at 11:20 in the middle of a conversation with 2 investors. He excused them both quietly. "Something you should know," he said. "Crystal Sohn." Before she left, she spent 12 minutes in the coat room on her phone. Sabrina waited. "She was on a call with a production company," Fletcher said. "A reality television production company based in Atlanta. The call happened at 9:53, about 8 minutes after the board removal was announced. The information settled." "She had a contingency," Sabrina said. "It looks that way." She moved very fast. He paused. "She also spoke to Dara Finch before leaving. Finch has already published a second piece. It frames tonight differently than the first. The first piece is straightforward, factual, favorable. The second raises questions about the audit timeline, implies the board action may have been accelerated beyond standard process, suggests possible procedural irregularities. That's Whitmore's narrative," Sabrina said. "He's not even out of the driveway and he's already building his counter. Through Christelle," Fletcher confirmed. "Who has, I should point out, a significant social media following and a very strong personal interest in reframing tonight as something other than a story in which she returned a piece of jewelry in front of 120 people and then left alone." Sabrina was quiet for a moment. She thought about the coat room, about 12 minutes, about a young woman in a borrowed, feeling evening dress, rapidly recalculating the assets available to her and making a decision with the speed of someone who had learned to think quickly in unstable situations. She understood something about that. "Leave it alone," she said. Fletcher looked at her. "Christelle, whatever she's negotiating with the production company, whatever she gave Finch tonight, leave it alone. Don't respond to the second piece. Don't counter it. Don't apply any pressure to her." She paused. "She has nothing that can touch what's on paper, and going after her publicly would be," she found the word, "beneath us. We are not beneath things." Fletcher studied her for a moment, then he nodded. "Understood." Eleanor drifted past them, caught Sabrina's eye and gave the smallest possible nod. "Well done." Sabrina looked around the room, at the wallpaper she had sourced, at the ironwork on the doors she had commissioned, at the garden beyond the dark windows where the jasmine was growing along the south wall, exactly where she had placed it, in soil she had worked with her own hands, in the years when she had still been building something she called a marriage, and was actually, without fully knowing it, building something that would outlast it entirely. At 11:40 she stepped into the hall, the portrait gallery, lined with 4 generations of Ashtons, and called her assistant. "How are you?" Theodora asked immediately, personally. "I'm standing," Sabrina said. "That's not nothing," Theodora said. "The Finch pieces. The second one is messier. We're not responding tonight." "Good call. The board chair called the main line 20 minutes ago. He wants a preliminary meeting tomorrow at 8. Put it on, and Theo. The volume of inquiries that have come in since 9 p.m. is Sabrina. I have never seen anything like it. Investors, developers, journalists, firms that have worked with Ashton Properties for years." "I know," Sabrina said. "We'll handle all of it carefully, one thing at a time." A pause. "Starting at 6 tomorrow morning." Theodora made a sound that was equal parts admiration and exhaustion. "You're going to make me come in at 6. "I'll have coffee," Sabrina said, and ended the call. She stood in the portrait gallery for a moment. 4 generations of Ashtons looked down at her from their frames. She had chosen the framing for 2 of these portraits herself. She had coordinated the restoration of 3 others, with a specialist in Richmond. She looked up at the oldest portrait, a woman in a dark dress, with careful eyes and capable hands, the wife of the man who had built the original structure of this house in 1887, a woman whose name did not appear on the deed. A woman who had built something that men had stood in front of for 130 years and called their own. "I see you," Sabrina said quietly. She walked back into the parlor, and the room turned toward her. Not because she commanded it, not because anyone orchestrated it, but the way rooms turn toward the thing that is genuinely, undeniably at their center. Eleanor caught her eye from across the space and raised her glass. Sabrina raised hers. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, standing in the house she had restored, and the company she had built, and the life she had refused to abandon entirely even when it had been made very small, she felt, without performance, without apology, without any qualifier at all, completely like herself. 5 months later, Savannah in early spring is the kind of beautiful that reminds you, the world has been here longer than your problems. Ashton Properties had been formally restructured under Sabrina's leadership. The announcement had generated coverage in 3 major business publications and a level of spot that Theodora, with characteristic understatement, as unprecedented for a Savannah-based firm. The new executive team was in place. The portfolio strategy that Sabrina had been developing for 15 years. In margins of documents, in late-night notes, in the quiet hours when Whitmore was at dinners, accepting credit for her frameworks, was being executed, finally, at scale. The house had been legally secured to the family trust within 60 days. Whitmore's attorneys had filed the expected challenges. They had not, ultimately, mounted a substantive defense of a position the documentation could not support. He retained an apartment in Atlanta and a legal team that was, by all accounts, working very hard for a client whose position was not improving. Crystal Sowane's television project had not been greenlit. Sabrina knew this because she paid attention to such things for approximately 3 weeks, after which she made a deliberate decision to stop paying attention to such things. And she kept it. Eleanor had moved more formally into the east wing of the family home, which felt right and true, and exactly as it should be. The woman who had protected the house returning, to live in it properly, with however many years she chose. She and Sabrina had breakfast together on Thursday mornings. It had started tentatively the week after the retirement party, and had solidified into something that neither of them had formally agreed to, and neither of them would consider breaking. They sat in the kitchen, not the dining room, with coffee and whatever was available, and they talked about the company, about the legal proceedings, about Eleanor's memories of the house when she was young, about Sabrina's childhood, about the long, costly, winding road that had brought them both to this table on Thursday mornings. Sabrina looked forward to Thursdays more than almost anything. On a Thursday in late February, Sabrina was in the library reviewing a proposal from the company's new development director when Fletcher arrived. He had taken to working from the house on the days when they had overlapping matters. He came in with a coffee, her specific order, which he had identified in the second week of working together, and never made her repeat, and sat down across from her desk with the ease of someone who had stopped being a visitor and become something that didn't have a clean name yet. Whitmore's team filed the supplemental brief, she said, without looking up from the proposal. I saw it, he said. It won't hold, gives it 2 weeks. She set the proposal down. She looked at Fletcher across the desk, across the coffee he had brought without being asked, across 16 months of documents and 5 months of Thursday mornings, and the entirely unannounced way that two people who had started as collaborators had become something that felt increasingly like a life being constructed in the same direction. Fletcher, she said. When the last motion is dismissed, when the final filing is resolved, and there's nothing left. She met his eyes. What are you going to do? He looked at her steadily. I was planning to stay, he said, simply. Without performance, she held his gaze. Good, she said, because I need someone who reads documents correctly and makes acceptable coffee, and that combination is genuinely harder to find than it should be. He smiled, a real smile. The kind that changes a face from the inside out. She smiled back. Outside, through the library's restored floor-to-ceiling windows, the Confederate jasmine along the south wall of the garden was beginning to bloom. White and persistent. And exactly where she had placed it all those years ago, in the April dirt of a marriage she had not yet understood, she was already quietly outgrowing. She had planted it believing that things built with your own hands are the things that last. She had been right about that. She had been right about more than anyone had given her credit for. That was no longer anyone's secret but hers to keep.